She had been grounded for 14 months. Her aircraft sat 30 feet away like a ghost no one dared touch. Then the roster arrived. Her son's team was trapped inside Ridgeback Canyon, the one piece of sky that had already swallowed 2 drones without leaving wreckage. 6 men hostiles on the ridgelines, extraction long overdue. No other pilot would fly it. She didn't ask. She climbed into the cockpit that wasn't cleared to fly and took the Warthog into the night at 150 feet. The canyon walls closed like jaws. RPG teams opened up from the high ground. A mortar crew waited on the floor to kill the helicopters before they could land. 3 hidden positions had been prepared for exactly this moment, to turn a rescue into a massacre. She made the passes anyway. Cannon fire lit the rock. The left engine overheated. Then the missile locked on her engines and refused to let go. She had seconds. One vertical climb into the thermal pocket the canyon had hidden for years. The explosion threw the aircraft sideways. She brought them out. But when the dust settled, she realized someone had been standing on the south ridgeline the entire time, watching, not fighting, just waiting for her. The hangar at Nellis Air Force Base smelled like hydraulic fluid and suspended time, not the exciting kind of suspended time, not the held breath moment before something happened, the other kind. The kind that accumulated in places where things used to happen and didn't anymore, where the air itself had learned to wait without expecting anything. Major Della Voss had been sitting on the same metal bench for 14 months, not literally. She went home, she slept. She ate meals that she prepared with the same efficiency she applied to everything, because efficiency was not a professional habit for Della. It was constitutional. But every morning she came back to this bench in Hangar 4 at Nellis, and every morning the bench received her the way benches received people who had nowhere else to be, which was without ceremony and without judgment. She had a technical manual open across her knees. Page 47, the hydraulic sequencing diagram for an A-10 Warthog, cross-referenced with the updated actuator specifications from the 2019 maintenance revision. She had read it so many times that she no longer read it exactly. She absorbed it. The way you absorb the words of a song you'd heard so often that hearing it and not hearing it had become the same experience. She had read page 47 11 times this week, not because she needed to, because Ironclad was 30 feet away, and this was as close as they let her get. The A-10 sat under the far overhang in the particular stillness of aircraft that weren't flying. There was a quality to a grounded plane that pilots recognized and civilians didn't. Something in the geometry, the way the weight settled, the way a machine designed for motion looked when motion had been taken from it. Ironclad wore it the way Della wore her own situation, with no visible distress and no visible acceptance either. Just presence, waiting. Scratches along the fuselage from a canyon wall she'd come within arm's reach of 18 months ago on a mission that no one discussed in formal settings anymore. A scar at the left wing root where the airframe had absorbed a shock wave that should have folded the aircraft and hadn't. One panel on the left flank stink still unpainted, the bare metal showing under the hangar lights, because the maintenance crew had started the repair, and then been told to hold pending the administrative review. The administrative review that had been pending for 14 months. Number 19 stenciled on the nose, in letters worn enough to suggest they'd been there since before everything that had happened, since before Della Voss had become the kind of name that people said quietly when they thought she wasn't listening. She knew every scratch by its story, by the exact moment in the exact piece of sky where Ironclad had acquired it, by the sound the aircraft had made, and what she had thought when she heard it, and what she had done in the next 3 seconds. She turned to page 48. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing nobody who hadn't flown with her could quite reconcile with everything else they'd heard. They expected visible energy, restlessness, the kinetic impatience of someone who flew attack aircraft through canyon terrain at altitudes that made flight controllers reach for their antacids. She had none of that. She had the specific stillness of someone who had spent 30 years learning that the sky rewarded patience more reliably than it rewarded speed, That the pilot who waited for the right moment outperformed the pilot who created moments by force, 9 times out of 10. That reading a situation and reading it correctly was worth more than reacting to it brilliantly. On the workbench beside her, next to her coffee thermos, and the folder of paperwork she'd already processed, and the pen she kept clipped to the folder's edge out of habit, sat a wristwatch, old, military issue strap of cracked brown leather, the kind that hadn't been standard issue since the early 90s, and hadn't looked new since some time before that. The crystal face was fractured, a single diagonal line across the glass, clean as a decision made quickly and committed to completely. She had worn it every day for 26 years. She had worn it through 3 deployments, 2 promotions, 1 marriage that had lasted 4 years, and ended without animosity, because they had both been better at their jobs than at being married, and 1 loss that had reorganized everything so fundamentally that she measured time in before and after. Tonight it sat on the bench beside the manual. Before she'd picked up the manual, she had taken it off, set it down, and not yet decided whether to put it back on. She was still deciding. The hangar lights hummed. Somewhere at the far end of the building, a mechanic was working on something that required periodic metallic tapping. The ventilation system moved air from one side of the space to the other, with the mechanical indifference of systems that did not understand context. Outside, the Nevada evening was cooling the desert, with the efficiency it always brought to the task, dropping 15 degrees in the hour after sunset the way it dropped every evening, as if it had a schedule and was committed to keeping it. Della Vos sat on her bench. Ride her manual waited. She had not always been a woman who waited well. That was the part of the story that people who only knew her from the last 14 months sometimes missed. They saw the stillness and assumed it was natural, assumed it was temperament, assumed she was the kind of person who had always been comfortable with patience. She was not. She had learned it. From Daniel, partly. Her brother had been the patient one by nature, the one who could sit with an unresolved question for weeks without discomfort, turning it over in his mind the way you turned a stone over to see what was underneath, unhurried and genuinely curious. She had watched him do it and thought it looked like peace and tried to learn how it worked, from flying, mostly. Because flight had requirements, and one of the requirements was the ability to wait for the right moment, without either rushing it or missing it. The canyon didn't care about your schedule. The wind didn't accommodate your preferences. The terrain was what it was, and you either learned to read it on its own terms, or you didn't come back, and those were the only 2 options. She had been learning for 30 years. She was still learning. The administrative review was now in its 14th month. The standard timeline for reviews of this category was, officially, 90 days. The fact that hers had run nearly 5 times that length was not officially addressed anywhere in the documentation she received. The documentation simply arrived at intervals, each piece informing her that her case remained under active consideration, and that she would be notified when a determination had been made. She had filed the most recent documentation in the folder, clipped the pen back to the edge, and returned to page 47. Because the alternative, spending the hours thinking about General Horace Pruitt, and the 23 people in that briefing room, and the 48 hours between her raising her hand and her access code stopping working, was not productive. And Della Vos was, constitutionally, a person who preferred productive, even if productive currently meant reading the same hydraulic diagram for the 11th time. Even if the hydraulic system it described belonged to an aircraft 30 feet away that she was not permitted to touch. She looked at Ironclad. Ironclad looked back, in the way that machines looked back at the people who knew them. Which was to say, it didn't. It was a machine. It had no awareness of her presence, but which felt, after enough years and enough hours and enough moments of the specific trust that developed between a pilot and an aircraft that had kept them both alive in conditions that suggested it shouldn't have been possible. Like something close to acknowledgement, she had flown Neen for 7 years. In those 7 years she had taken it into terrain that the aircraft's own design specifications described as operating outside intended parameters. She had brought it back from altitudes and speeds and angles that added up, on paper, to outcomes that should have been different. She had asked things of it that she would not have asked of most pilots she knew, and it had given her those things with the mechanical generosity of a well-maintained system that had been treated with respect, and had something like an opinion about the relationship. 14 months of sitting 30 feet away from it, unable to touch it, was its own particular kind of long. She turned back to page 48 and heard footsteps. Colonel Birch Langley walked like a man who had places to be and had decided some time ago that conveying urgency about it was nobody else's concern. It was one of the first things Della had noticed about him 15 years ago on a flight line in the Nevada summer, and it was one of the things that had remained constant through everything since. Langley's walk said, "I know what I'm doing and I know where I'm going, and the speed at which I'm getting there is a choice I've already made, and am not interested in revising based on external input." Tonight his walk said something underneath all of that. Something she identified before he was close enough to speak, before she could read his face, from the specific quality of his footsteps alone. He didn't sit down. That was what confirmed it. Birch Langley sat down. In every situation she had ever seen him in, briefings, arguments, crises, the particular kind of controlled chaos that descended on operations centers when multiple things went wrong simultaneously, he found a surface and he sat on it, because he believed, with the conviction of someone who had been tested on this belief multiple times, and found it to hold, that you made better decisions when you weren't performing readiness, that standing up didn't make you more prepared, it just made you tired. He was standing. "You eating dinner?" he said. "I ate, you didn't. I checked the mess, then why did you ask?" He looked at her, then at Ironclad, then at the watch sitting on the workbench beside the manual. "There's a situation," he said. "There's always a situation, Della." Just her name. The specific way he said it when he was done with the approach, and ready to get to the thing. She looked up from the manual. His face was doing what his face did when the information hadn't caught up to the expression yet. She had learned to read Birch Langley's face over 15 years of working alongside him, arguing with him, trusting him with things she didn't trust to many people. She had learned which silences meant he was thinking, and which meant he had finished thinking, and was waiting for her to catch up, and which meant something was happening that was outside the usual range of things. This was the third kind. "Talk," she said. He talked. The signal had come in at 1803 hours 44 minutes ago. Low-band frequency, partially degraded. The kind of transmission that happened when terrain was consuming most of the signal, and the person sending it had decided that attempting to transmit despite poor odds was preferable to the alternative, which was silence, which in a situation that warranted a distress signal was the worst available option. The signal had come from Ridgeback Canyon. The name moved through the air between them and settled. Ridgeback Canyon was 40 miles northeast of Nellis, carved through high desert rock over a geological span of time that had no interest in accommodating anything that flew. The walls ran narrow in the critical sections, in some places less than 300 feet from face to face, with wind shear patterns that changed without warning and without the cyclical predictability that made other challenging terrain manageable. GPS reliability inside the canyon was poor. The electronic interference created by the rock composition and the geometry of the walls played havoc with navigation systems in ways that had never been fully mapped because the equipment needed to map it kept failing when exposed to the conditions it was supposed to be mapping. 3 years ago, 2 surveillance drones had been sent in to conduct a preliminary survey. Neither had come out, no wreckage recovered, no signal after the point of entry, just 2 aircraft-shaped absences in the database, and a report that described the incident as an unresolved equipment malfunction, and recommended that further drone operations in the area be postponed pending technical review. The technical review had not produced a follow-on mission. Ridgeback had been designated restricted airspace, R4808N on the navigation charts. A block of grey on the maps that pilots flew around and didn't discuss much. The way pilots didn't discuss many things that didn't have clean explanations, because the culture of the work valued certainty and Ridgeback had produced none. Personnel, she said. How many? 6 designation Bravo actual. Reconnaissance tasking. Scheduled ingresses at 1400 hours. Extraction by 1700. Della looked at the watch on the bench, 1851 hours. They were almost 2 hours past scheduled extraction contact. At approximately 15:30, unidentified hostile force. Armed, organized based on what we could piece together from the partial signal. Casualties, unknown. The transmission was too degraded. We caught fragments. What fragments? He paused here. The pause that meant he was deciding whether to give her the direct version or the prepared version, and she could see him decide, in real time, to give her the direct one. Commander's voice. Requesting extraction. 2 words that sounded like men down. Then static, no follow-up transmission, nothing. Air assets, 3 pilots declined the approach. 2 more on medical hold. The 6th attempted entry 8 months ago on a different mission profile and turned back at 17 minutes due to instrument failure across 4 systems simultaneously. Della processed this in the order it needed to be processed. No available air assets. 6 personnel pinned in the one piece of airspace that had already demonstrated an ability to consume aircraft without explanation. An unidentified hostile force with unknown size and unknown capability. 2 hours past extraction window, contact cut off, casualties unknown. Read me the roster, she said. Della. Birch. Not a request, not a demand, just her name for him. Deployed in the specific register that they had both learned over 15 years meant. We are past the part where you consider not telling me. He looked at her for one moment. The full weight of whatever he knew about what was in that roster, sitting in the look. The specific reluctance of someone who understood that some information once delivered could not be undelivered and that the world would be different on the other side of it. Then he read it. 5 names came and went. Ranks. Unit designations. Personnel she had no personal connection to, whose welfare mattered to her in the way that all personnel mattered. Professionally, completely, with the understanding that every name on a roster was a person with a life that extended in all directions beyond the mission, but who did not catch on anything specific inside her. And then the 6th commander, Sergeant Theodore Voss. She did not move. She did not blink. She did not make a sound. The hangar continued being a hangar around her. The ventilation system moved air. The mechanic at the far end tapped metal against metal. The overhead lights held their steady fluorescent frequency. Ironclad sat under the overhang, exactly as it had been sitting. Everything exactly as it had been 10 seconds ago, except that the world had reorganized itself, quietly and completely, and without asking, the way it had done once before when she was 26 years old. And she was sitting with the new arrangement and taking its measure before she trusted herself to speak. Spell the last name, she said. Della, spell it. He spelled it. She closed the technical manual, carefully. With both hands, the way you closed something that deserved to be placed rather than dropped. Set it on the bench beside the watch. Picked up the watch. Looked at the cracked crystal for a moment that had no specific duration. Put it on, and stood up. Here is what Della Voss did not do in the 30 seconds after Langley spoke her son's name. She did not gasp, did not press a hand to her mouth, did not say, "Oh God," or "no," or "that can't be right," or any of the words that filled those moments in other contexts, in other people's lives. In the films she occasionally watched on long evenings in the quarters, and found herself assessing for tactical accuracy rather than emotional resonance. What she did was calculate, immediately and automatically, the way the aircraft systems ran their own diagnostics. Not because she had forced herself to, because the brain she had built over 52 years defaulted, under pressure, to assessment, to the inventory of what was known and what was unknown and what could be done about the known parts. Theo, 27 years old, 5 feet 11, which he had gotten from no one since she was 5'6", and his father had been 5'9", and genetics occasionally produced its own opinions. Left-handed, which he had gotten from her. stubborn in the specific way that looked like flexibility, until you tried to move him from a position he had actually committed to, which he had also gotten from her. The ability to stay functionally quiet in a crisis while the rest of his nervous system managed the crisis, which he had gotten from her, and had she knew, resented getting, at least once, because it made him hard to read, and being hard to read was lonely sometimes. She hadn't known he'd transferred to Bravo Actual. 6 months ago he had called her on a Tuesday evening and mentioned reassignment, new unit. He had used the language of someone summarizing, rather than explaining, which she had noted and not pushed on, because there was a particular kind of pride in their family that ran like a structural element through everything. And sometimes that pride made them worse at asking and worse at offering. And they both knew it, and neither of them had found a way around it that didn't feel like a performance of a different kind. He hadn't told her the unit, she hadn't asked, and now he was in Ridgeback Canyon, past the extraction window by nearly 2 hours, with unknown casualties and an unidentified hostile force and no air cover. Stop. Calculate. Not yet. Feel it after. When you can afford it. When there's nothing left that needs doing and the feeling has somewhere to go besides the cockpit. I need the frequency, she said. You're grounded, I'm aware. If I facilitate, Birch, she turned to face him. Not the partial attention she rationed to conversations she was only half inside, all of it. The full weight of 30 years of working with someone who was one of 3 people in the world she genuinely trusted, and the only one of those 3 who was currently in this hangar. You drove here yourself instead of sending someone. You read me that roster yourself instead of having communications do it. You've been standing for 4 minutes, he said nothing. You already decided, she said. That's why you came. The silence between them lasted exactly long as it needed to last. Then Langley reached into the left breast pocket of his uniform jacket and removed a folded piece of paper. Set it on the bench beside where the manual had been, beside the empty space where the watch had been before she put it back on. The paper contained a radio frequency, a set of grid coordinates, 2 lines of text total, nothing else. No commentary. No instruction, no language that could be quoted in a report. I'm going to speak with the duty officer, he said, about the evening maintenance schedule for the line aircraft. He walked toward the far end of the hangar. He did not look back. Technical Sergeant Roy Alderman had been maintaining Aircraft 19 for 2 years and 3 months, and in that time he had developed what he would have described, if anyone had asked him, as a professional familiarity with the machine, and what he would not have described to anyone. Because it was not the kind of thing you described, as something that had stopped being purely professional sometime around the 8th month. Ironclad had opinions, not in any mystical sense, not in any sense that Alderman would have said out loud, in a setting where it could be quoted back to him, but in the practical sense that long-experienced mechanics understood and didn't discuss much. The sense in which machines that had been pushed to the edge of their design specifications and brought back from that edge repeatedly developed behaviors that were technically explicable through accumulated wear patterns and material stress responses, but which, in practice, felt like something more like character. 019 ran differently on cold mornings. Preferred, and there was no better word, even if the word was imprecise. Approaches that kept the left engine in shadow during ground operations. Had a fuel transfer pattern between tanks that the specification described as automatic but which, in Alderman's experience, happened more consistently when he talked through what he was doing. He had never told anyone this. He had simply continued talking to the aircraft while he worked on it, quietly, in the way of someone who had made a private accommodation and was comfortable keeping it private. He saw Della Voss coming across the hangar floor before she was halfway to him, the walk. That was always the first thing. She had a walk that other pilots occasionally mentioned, without being able to fully characterize it. Not aggressive, not rushed. Deliberate in the specific way of someone who had already completed the thinking required for the next action, and was now simply executing the action, which removed all the tentativeness that other people carried in their movement. She was wearing the watch. He noted that because she had arrived without it tonight, which had registered, because in 2 years and 3 months he had not seen her without it, she was also wearing her flight suit, which she had not been wearing when she arrived this evening. He set down his clipboard. Sergeant Alderman, ma'am, status on 01E. Not can I ask you something? Not I need to know. Just status. The direct entry into the relevant information. The conversational equivalent of the approach she flew. No unnecessary airspace consumed. He gave her what he had. Fuel at 73%, topped from this morning's scheduled maintenance. Hydraulics functional, topped this afternoon. Left stabilizer with the known feedback inconsistency that had been in the maintenance queue for 6 weeks pending parts availability. Functional, but requiring compensatory input, which meant flying it was manageable if you knew it was there, and adjustable if you understood how the inconsistency expressed itself across different flight profiles, which he knew she did. Flare countermeasure system partial. 2 pods functional, 1 degraded, which gave her 3 suppression deployments before the system was exhausted. Cannon armed, loaded to standard. 2 of the 5 targeting subsystems had been taken offline the previous week for the review process. The remaining 3 were functional. She listened without writing anything down. He had noticed early in their association that she did not take notes during briefings. He had eventually understood that this was not inattention but its opposite. She was encoding the information directly, in whatever internal system she maintained that allowed her to recall maintenance specifications and flight data with the kind of accuracy that occasionally made newer crew members believe she must have reviewed the records just before speaking, when in fact she had reviewed them once, weeks ago. Can it fly, she said. Not is it cleared for flight. Not does it have authorization, can it fly. Alderman looked at 19. He did the honest version of the assessment, not the version shaped by what he was supposed to say, or what the administrative status of the aircraft suggested he should say. He looked at the fuel, the hydraulic readings, the known inconsistency in the stabilizer, and what he understood about how it behaved above and below specific speed ranges, the partial flare system, the 2 offline targeting subsystems, and what it meant to fly weapons employment without them, which for most pilots meant significantly degraded capability, and for Della Voss meant flying the way she had apparently been flying for 30 years. It can fly, he said. She moved past him toward the cockpit ladder, without another word. He stepped aside, not because he'd been instructed to, not because of any order that had been given, or any authorization that had been received, because in 2 years and 3 months, Alderman had developed the opinion, and he kept this one as private as his opinion about the aircraft's character, that there were situations in which stepping aside was the only correct response to someone walking with that particular walk toward that particular aircraft. He stepped aside. She climbed up. The cockpit received her. That was the only word for it. She settled into the seat, and something in the geometry of the situation resolved, the way a sentence resolved when the word you'd been searching for arrived and you understood that the sentence had been waiting for exactly that word and no other. 3 years of flying together, Della Voss and Aircraft 09. That was what 2 years and 3 months of maintenance records, carefully read, had told Alderman. 23 years. Across aircraft designations and tail numbers and base assignments. Ironclad had not always been called Ironclad, and Della Voss had not always been a major, and the missions had changed, and the theatres had changed, and the circumstances had changed, and what had not changed was the pilot and the aircraft type, and the specific relationship between them that produced outcomes that the performance data suggested should not have been possible. She ran pre-flight by memory. He watched her hands move through the sequence from the ground below, switch by switch, system by system, not consulting the laminated checklist clipped to the left side of the instrument panel, not referencing anything external. Just her hands and the aircraft and 30 years of conversation between them, conducted in the language of switches and gauges and the specific resistance or responsiveness that told you whether a system was doing what it was supposed to be doing. She keyed the radio. Tower, this is aircraft NY9. Requesting emergency departure. Personal recovery situation active. A pause from the tower. The pause of a duty controller encountering a situation their training had covered and their experience had not, or 19. You are not on the active schedule. Please identify pilot and provide authorization code. She thought about this for exactly as long as she needed to think about it. It was not long. Then she pushed the throttle forward. The engines came up. Alderman stepped back further, out of the jet wash that was building. He watched the aircraft begin to move, watched it taxi toward the runway, with the unhurried deliberation of something that had been waiting for this, and had decided the waiting was finished. The tower came back on frequency with escalating urgency. 19 did not respond. The aircraft reached the runway. The throttle went to takeoff power. The twin GE engines built to the specific roar that Alderman had heard hundreds of times in 2 years and 3 months, and which still, every single time, did something to the base of his sternum that he had stopped trying to name, and ironclad went. The Nellis Air Force Base control tower at 1903 hours contained 4 people, the senior controller, 2 duty officers, and a specialist on his 3rd week of active assignment, who would later describe the next 12 minutes as the most educational of his professional life, and would not be more specific than that in any formal context. The senior controller's name was Master Sergeant Claude Wick, 51 years old, 22 years in air traffic control, 17 of them at Nellis, which meant he had seen most of what there was to see in terms of aircraft and pilots, and the various ways that the relationship between them could express itself at the edges of what was formally authorized. He watched aircraft 019 depart without clearance and drop off radar coverage simultaneously, which was the part that the specialist found most remarkable. Not that the aircraft had left without authorization, which was unusual but not unprecedented in an emergency context, but that it had immediately descended below the terrain masking threshold and vanished from the scope. Who's spying it? The question went to the duty officer, who checked the access logs with the speed of someone who already suspected the answer and was verifying rather than discovering. According to the maintenance log, Al-Wanin was offline for systems review. Pilot is not recorded. That's not what I asked, the duty officer understood. There's one pilot associated with that aircraft at that altitude profile. Wick did not need the name specified. He had been at Nellis for 17 years. He knew the name. He stood at the window for a moment. The runway was empty. The desert beyond the perimeter was dark and flat, and the sky above it was the blue-grey of evening advancing toward night. There was no visible evidence of the aircraft that had just left, which was in itself evidence of something, specifically of a pilot who had practiced disappearing from radar as a tactical option for long enough that it had become instinct. He thought about picking up the phone. He thought about who he would call. He thought about what those calls would produce, and in what time frame, and what would be happening in Ridgeback Canyon during that time frame. He set the phone back down. Keep frequency 243. 0 clear and monitored, he said. Priority traffic. If there's any transmission on that frequency, I want to hear it immediately, sir. Are we logging the departure? Wick looked at the duty log. Log it as an emergency departure. Pilot unidentified, 1857 hours. Note that tower was unable to make radio contact prior to takeoff. And the aircraft status? Log it as active. He turned back to the window. Active, not unauthorized, not rogue, active. The word that meant, something is happening out there that we are tracking, and we have not yet determined what it requires from us, and until we do, the correct posture is attention rather than intervention. He had made that call before. He had made it correctly before. He intended to do so again. Across the base, in the operations center, Colonel Birch Langley sat at his desk with a duty log open in front of him and a pen in his hand. The log would record tonight's evening maintenance activities for the Nellis flight line. It was a routine document. It was completed every evening by the senior officer on duty. It contained no information of strategic significance. It was, in the architecture of military documentation, one of the least consequential pieces of paper generated on any given day at any given installation. Tonight it was the most important piece of paper on the base. Because what it said about aircraft 019 between the hours of 1800 and 1900 would be, once written and signed, the official record of what had occurred. And the official record had a relationship to other things, to administrative reviews, to career determinations, to the question of whether a grounded major had departed in an aircraft without authorization and what the appropriate response to that departure was. Langley wrote carefully. Aircraft 019, Mechanical Systems Evaluation, 1847 to 1900. Logged as routine maintenance check per standing schedule, he signed his name, his rank, the date. Then he set the pen down and looked at the phone. The phone was connected to, among other places, the office of Deputy Director Gwen Hardcastle in Washington, D.C. He had a number for that office. He had used it twice before. Both times the calls had been substantive. Both times they had produced outcomes that were more complicated than the calls themselves had suggested they would produce. He looked at the phone for a while. Then he looked at the frequency monitor on the secondary screen to his left, which was showing 243.0 as clear and active. And he made his decision, which was the same decision Wick had made in the tower, arrived at by a different route but producing the same destination. He folded his hands on the desk and waited. He was not good at waiting in the way that Della was good at waiting. He did not have her facility for stillness. He was aware, sitting at his desk with his hands folded and his frequency monitor showing a clear channel and the duty log signed and set aside, that he was a man in a specific kind of suspense that had no productive outlet, waiting on information that would arrive or not arrive, according to what was happening 40 miles northeast in a piece of restricted airspace that had already established its credentials for consuming things sent into it. He waited anyway, because that was what was available to do. And because Della Voss had walked to that aircraft with the walk she had, and climbed in with the facilities of someone returning to a conversation that had been interrupted rather than ending one, and he had known her for 15 years, and in 15 years she had never started something she did not finish. He waited. The approach to Ridgeback Canyon came from the northeast, through a stretch of high desert that offered nothing in the way of landmarks and everything in the way of darkness. The terrain below was flat and featureless in the way of land that had been doing the same thing for long enough that it had stopped varying, and then the ground rose sharply, and the flatness ended, and the canyon system began as a series of smaller formations that funneled toward the main entrance, like a sentence narrowing toward its point. Della descended through 190 feet and continued down. She had been in the air for 31 minutes. The fuel read 68%. She'd been burning a little hot on the right engine, something she had noticed at takeoff and filed away, and was managing through slight throttle differential. Nothing that required action yet. The left stabilizer was expressing its known inconsistency at a level she had characterized on the approach as conversational, present, requiring acknowledgement, not requiring argument. Everything else was where it was supposed to be. She ran the approach by feel. The instruments were functional, but the instruments were not what she was primarily using. She was using what Daniel had given her. The understanding that terrain communicated if you knew how to listen, that the air over rock moved differently than the air over sand, that the pressure changes at canyon entrances had specific signatures if you had enough experience to read them the way you read a face, not by feature, but holistically, the whole thing at once, the meaning arriving before the analysis. She had flown Ridgeback twice, the first time 18 years ago, in the evaluation exercise that had produced the flight controller's note about a pilot operating on information not available to others. She had been 34. She had come through the canyon in 40 minutes. At altitudes, her section leader described afterward as unnecessarily aggressive, and she had come out the other side with a complete internal map of the terrain that she had never needed to consult documentation to update, because she had encoded it at a level below language, in the part of the brain that stores physical knowledge, the kind that lived in the hands and the body rather than the mind. The second time had been the mission 18 months ago, the one that had produced the scratch on the fuselage and the scar at the wing root and the unpainted panel, the one nobody discussed in formal settings. She was flying it for the third time now. The entrance appeared ahead in the fading light. A gap in the rock that from this angle looked like an afterthought. Like the canyon had been formed by something that had simply forgotten to leave space, and had then reconsidered at the last moment, too late to do it properly. She dropped to 155 feet. The proximity alert system began flashing with the automated distress of a system doing exactly its designed function in a situation its designers had not imagined. She reached down and switched it off, not impatiently, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of removing a tool that had become counterproductive. The alerts were calibrated for standard approach corridors. This was not a standard approach corridor, and the alerts would be constant and would contribute nothing except noise, which was the one thing she could not afford. What she needed was silence, the productive kind, the kind in which information arrived. She keyed the radio, Bravo Actual. This is Stormcaller. Do you copy? The frequency returned static with the consistency of terrain that had opinions about radio signals. She held the heading. The canyon walls rose on either side as she entered, narrowing her world from the wide desert to the specific corridor of rock and air that Ridgeback offered to the people who came into it. The left wall was close enough that the cockpit instruments registered it as a proximity concern, even without the alert system active. The right wall was slightly further, which she remembered, which matched her internal map, which confirmed that the map was still accurate. She keyed again, Bravo Actual, Stormcaller inbound. Confirm your position if you are receiving, static. She did not adjust her heading. She did not reduce speed. She continued into the canyon at 150 feet, with the engines maintaining steady power and the stabilizer delivering its intermittent complaint, and the fuel reading 66%, and the Nevada dark pressing in from every direction except ahead, and then fragmented and thin and fighting through interference that the canyon walls were generating with their usual indifferent competence. A voice, young, male. The controlled flatness of someone who had made a decision about fear, not to deny it, which didn't work, but to place it somewhere it wouldn't interfere with function, which did work if you were sufficiently disciplined, and this voice was sufficiently disciplined. Stormcaller, Bravo Actual, we copy you. 3 personnel with significant injuries. 2 personnel mobile. We are holding at the northern rock shelf grid. Static consumed the coordinates. Hostile elements active on multiple ridgelines. Northeast approach has confirmed RPG capability. Copy, Bravo Actual. I'm 2 minutes from your position. Keep everyone flat when the engines get loud. I'll announce before weapons employment. A pause. Stormcaller. The voice with something underneath the operational layer. We weren't sure anyone was coming. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about Langley setting the paper on the bench and walking away without looking back. About Alderman stepping aside. About Wick at the tower window deciding to call 240 for 3.0 active rather than unauthorized. About the specific constellation of people who had made the specific decisions that had put her in this cockpit in this canyon at this moment. About a name on a roster that she was not thinking about yet. Someone's coming, she said. Hold your position. She pushed the throttle forward, and the canyon closed around her, and Ironclad's engines bounced their sound off the rock walls and came back in waves, and somewhere ahead on a shelf she couldn't see yet, 6 people heard it arriving. Because the sound came first, it always came first. Low and metallic and rising out of the dark, like something the canyon had been holding in reserve. Like something that had made a promise a long time ago about coming back. On the northern rock shelf, Sergeant Theodore Voss heard it and felt it before he understood it. Felt it in the chest the way you felt things that your body recognized before your mind had time to name them. He had heard this sound before, not in this canyon, not in a situation like this one. In other contexts, on other days, in the particular background of a life lived alongside someone for whom this sound was ordinary and consequential and worth teaching a person to recognize, The man beside him said, "Is that air cover?" "Yes," Theo said. "How do you know?" He didn't answer right away, because the answer was not a simple answer. It was the kind of answer that required more context than a dark rock shelf in a hostile canyon permitted. The kind that involved a woman with a broken watch, and a technical manual, and 30 years of knowing how to find the one right angle in a canyon that looked like it had no right angles. The kind that involved his own name on a roster she hadn't known to look for. "Trust me," he said. "Keep your head down." And above them, Ironclad came over the ridge line with its nose down, and its engines full, and its pilot already calculating the northeast ridgeline and the RPG position and the first of the things that needed to be done. And the canyon, which had been keeping its silence for 2 hours, which had taken drones and swallowed signals, and held 6 people in its dark interior, like a problem it hadn't decided how to solve. The canyon stopped being quiet. The canyon received Ironclad the way it received everything, without welcome and without warning. One moment Della was in open air, the desert spreading flat and dark in every direction, the horizon a clean line between earth and sky. The next moment the walls were there, rising on both sides with the abruptness of a decision already made, channeling the aircraft into the specific corridor of rock and reduced airspace that Ridgeback Canyon offered to anyone willing to enter it at 150 feet above the canyon floor. At full combat power in the dark, she dropped to 140. Not because the tactical situation required it yet, because she needed to establish her baseline before the canyon got narrow, before the wind patterns started in earnest, before the rock walls began doing what they did to airspeed and pressure, and the 1,000 small inputs that told a pilot where they were in 3-dimensional space. She needed to know how Ironclad felt at this altitude tonight, in this air, with the left stabilizer running its known complaint, and the right engine burning slightly hot and the fuel at 66% and falling. She needed a conversation with the aircraft before the conversation with the canyon began. Ironclad answered the way it answered, through the controls, through the specific resistance or responsiveness that told her things no gauge could quantify. Whether the airframe was confident or cautious, whether the systems were integrated or working separately, whether this was a machine in good form or a machine making accommodations. You learn to read it the way you learn to read anything that communicated through behavior rather than language, through attention and repetition and the willingness to be wrong about what you were hearing until you were right. Tonight Ironclad felt like what it was, a machine that had been through something and hadn't fully recovered. Running, functional, willing, but carrying the accumulated consequence of a hard mission 18 months ago and 14 months of intermittent maintenance since, and the specific costs of the last 31 minutes of flight. And it was telling her all of this, not to complain, but because they had an understanding, the two of them, that honesty about condition was more useful than performance. She received the information and adjusted. The northeast ridgeline was 800 meters ahead and above her current altitude. The heat signatures Bravo Actual had reported as RPG capability were not yet visible on her degraded targeting system. 2 of the 5 subsystems offline meant she was working with 60% of her normal sensor picture, which meant she was working with memory and geometry to fill the rest. She had the geometry. 18 years ago, the first time she had flown Ridgeback, she had spent the first 2 miles of the approach, reading the northeast ridgeline the way Daniel had taught her to read terrain. Not for what was there right now, but for what the shape of it suggested, about what could be placed there by someone who understood sight lines and angles and the basic physics of weapons employment from elevation. She had identified 3 positions on that ridgeline that were structurally ideal for emplaced fire coverage of the approach corridor. She had noted them, filed them, had never had reason to use that information, until now. She adjusted her approach angle 2 degrees left. Not enough to telegraph the adjustment. Enough to change her angle of exposure to the uppermost of the 3 positions, which was where she would place a launcher if she were the one placing launchers. The canyon walls closed in as she flew deeper. The acoustic environment changed, The engine sound that had been moving freely through open air was now bouncing, returning from the rock faces in compressed waves that arrived at the cockpit as a slightly different quality of noise. Louder, more textured, the specific sound signature of low-altitude flight in confined terrain, which some pilots found destabilizing and which Della found useful, because it told her things about the walls that her instruments didn't. She gave the canyon 3 miles to tell her what it knew. Then she armed the cannon, the targeting system, the 3 functional subsystems, acquired the northeast ridgeline and began building a firing solution with the data it had. Incomplete. 40% less information than standard. But the gaps aligned with what she already knew, and she filled them the way she always filled gaps in sensor data, which was with the calculation that her instruments were performing the mechanics of, and her experience was performing the judgment of, and the combination of the two was, in her assessment, sufficient. She keyed the radio one more time. Bravo Actual, Stormcaller. Confirm you are at the northern shelf and below the ridgeline. Confirmed. All personnel flat. Stand by. She flew the final 400 meters to the northeast ridgeline at 140 feet, with the cannon armed and the targeting solution built, and the wind doing what the wind in Ridgeback did at this point in the approach, which was the rotational pull on the left wing that she had felt 18 years ago, and had encoded as completely as she had encoded everything else about this canyon. She compensated for it without thinking. The way you compensated for things you had been compensating for long enough that the compensation had become part of the action, and then she fired. The Jiao-8 cannon, 7 barrels, 3,900 rounds per minute, the specific sound of which had been compared to various things by various people, and which Della had always thought compared most accurately to the canyon itself suddenly deciding to speak. Opened up on the northeast ridgeline, and said what it had to say. 3 seconds. The ridgeline where Bravo Actual had marked the RPG position stopped being a ridgeline with people on it. Dust rose in a column that the canyon's own wind immediately began to redistribute. Rock fragments asked in the decelerating parabolas that airborne debris always followed, more slowly than intuition expected, the physics of it always slightly dreamlike from altitude. The sound of the cannon and the sound of the impact arrived at the cockpit in a sequence so compressed, it was almost simultaneous, but not quite. And in that not quite was the confirmation she was listening for, the acoustic signature of rounds making contact with the target zone. She pulled up, banked left, came around the western wall in the tight arc that this section of the canyon permitted, which was tighter than she would have preferred, and exactly as tight as she had remembered. And the canyon went quiet. 4 seconds of nothing. Which was information, because silence in Ridgeback Canyon after a weapons engagement did not mean the engagement was over. It meant something had absorbed what had just happened, and was now making a new set of decisions. And the quality of a silence, its texture, its duration, where it was coming from and where it wasn't, told you things about what kind of decisions were being made. This silence had the quality of redistribution. Elements that had been in one set of positions were moving to another set, not retreating, repositioning. Which meant what she was dealing with was not a force that had been broken by the first pass. It was a force that was adapting to the first pass. She expanded her scan to the south face. Movement low on the south face, 400 meters from Bravo Actual's position. 2 figures moving between boulder formations with the economy of people who had done this before and knew how to do it efficiently. No wasted steps, no hesitation at decision points, the movement of people operating from a practiced framework rather than improvising under pressure. She had noted it on the first pass as a background observation. The northeast ridgeback position had been textbook, clean sight lines and elevation advantage, and the angle of withdrawal built into the placement, and now the south face movement was confirming it. This force had been trained, not locally trained. Not the kind of training that produced competent fighters who understood the basics. The kind that produced fighters who thought in terms of overlapping fields of fire and fallback positions, and the relationship between primary and secondary objectives. The kind that took time and resources and, Most relevantly, the kind that was deliberate, intentional. Applied to this specific location with this specific terrain in mind, someone had prepared for Ridgeback. She filed the information. In the part of her mind that was collecting everything about tonight, that didn't fit the simple explanation, because simple explanations for complicated situations were usually wrong, and the cost of being wrong in this context was not something she was willing to calculate. She set up for the second pass. The south face boulder formation was recessed from the main canyon wall in a way that created a shadow pocket, a dead zone for standard attack angles. To put ordnance on the two movers before they reached their next covered position, she needed to come in along the eastern wall at 120 feet, which was 20 feet lower than the first pass, and hold the attack geometry for 4 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than the first pass had required. She had 4 seconds at 120 feet in Ridgeback's wind shear. She had done more difficult things in this canyon. She set the angle. The left stabilizer, which had been conversational for the first pass, became argumentative on the approach to the second. The inconsistency in its feedback spiked at 115 feet, producing a control input demand in her right hand that required active counter pressure, not the passive acknowledgement she'd been giving it. She spread her grip, redistributed the load across her wrist and forearm, and held the approach while the stabilizer made its case. Not now, she told it. Not aloud. The internal version. We'll address this properly after. The stabilizer continued making its case. She held the approach anyway. The cannon fired 4 seconds. She held the trigger a beat beyond what the tactical picture strictly required, because the geometry of the shadow pocket demanded it. A shorter burst would have put rounds into the near edge of the formation and left the depth of it intact, which would have given the movers cover she couldn't afford to leave them. She pulled up with less altitude buffer than she would have chosen, and felt ironclad shudder through the edge of its own cannon wash, the aircraft briefly encountering the disturbed air that the weapon had created, the airframe registering the turbulence in a full-body shudder that lasted 2 seconds and resolved. The stabilizer spike went red for those 2 seconds, then settled back to argumentative. She breathed, checked the south face, one figure down in the boulder debris, one gone, into the dust behind secondary cover, position unknown. She expanded her scan systematically. North wall, canyon floor, eastern corridor. The western sections she hadn't cleared yet, nothing resolved immediately, which was its own kind of alarm. A fighter who had gone to ground in a canyon this narrow was either retreating toward the canyon exit, which she could manage, or repositioning for a new angle, which she needed to find before they found it first. Bravo Actual, Stormcaller, south face partially suppressed. I have one mover unaccounted for. Keep your heads down and report any visual contact. Copy. No visual from our position. Keep reporting. She maintained altitude and continued scanning. 40 seconds later, Bravo Actual came back. Stormcaller, canyon floor, west side. 200 meters from our position. She found it before he finished the sentence. Not the missing mover, something worse. A mortar crew. 2 personnel, working with the focused speed of a team that had rehearsed this. Baseplate going down with the practiced efficiency of people who had done it under pressure before. Bipod assembly. Sight alignment. One operator preparing the ammunition while the other worked the elevation. At this range and angle, they could drop around on the northern shelf where Bravo Actual was holding in under 90 seconds. She did not have 90 seconds to spare. She rolled ironclad into a descending arc. Tighter than the aircraft preferred, tighter than the available altitude margin made comfortable, and brought the nose down toward the canyon floor. The left engine temperature warning went amber. She noted it the way she noted the stabilizer. Filed it. Did not react to it. Because reacting to it now meant taking attention from the mortar crew, and attention was the resource she could least afford to divide at this moment. The cannon fired. She held the trigger longer than tactical doctrine recommended, because the angle was wrong, and she knew it, and the only way to correct for a bad angle was to compensate with duration, which meant staying on the run longer than was comfortable, which meant exposing Ironclad to the threat envelope longer than was comfortable, She was uncomfortable for approximately 3 additional seconds. Then the mortar position on the canyon floor stopped being a mortar position. She pulled up. The left engine temperature went from amber to orange in the climb. She adjusted the throttle on the left side, reduced the demand, shifted load to the right engine, and watched the gauge. Orange held for 70 seconds, then dropped to amber. She breathed and began planning for the third problem, which was the one she hadn't found yet. Nellis Operations, aircraft in Junín. She was at 185 feet in the wider basin section 2 miles into the canyon, giving herself a moment of relative airspace while she ran the next calculation. Fuel at 51%, left engine amber, right engine nominal, stabilizer difficult but manageable. Flares at 2 functional pods, 1 degraded, 3 deployments remaining before she was flying without countermeasures. Bravo Actual was alive, moving. She had watched them begin the slow, covered traverse toward the eastern LZ after the mortar crew went down, the 6 shapes visible from above in the canyon's fading light, moving with the specific deliberateness of people who were hurt, and had decided that knowing they were hurt was not the same as stopping. They needed extraction, and extraction needed the Chinooks. 0 Junín. This is Nellis Operations. Go ahead. 6 personnel requiring immediate extraction, Ridgeback Canyon. All personnel located, moving to LZ. Grid, she read the coordinates from memory. The flat shelf 300 meters east of Bravo Actual's original position that she had identified on her first pass as the only viable landing zone in this section of the canyon. LZ is a flat shelf, eastern position. 40 meters wide approximately. Approach from the south is compromised. Northern approach workable. I need 2 Chinooks and I need them in the air now. A pause on the operations frequency. The pause of someone who was processing a request that had multiple layers of complication, the most immediate of which was that the person making the request was a grounded major flying an aircraft that was not officially in the air. Then, not the duty officer Langley. E1 copy your traffic. Extraction is being coordinated. ETA on rotary assets 18 minutes, 18 minutes. She ran the numbers immediately and automatically, the way she ran all numbers that had tactical consequence. Bravo Actual moving at wounded pace across 300 meters of canyon floor, supporting non-mobile personnel, under potential threat from at least 1 unaccounted for hostile element. Estimate 16 minutes to the LZ. The Chinooks arriving at the 18-minute mark meant the birds would be descending into the LZ, while Bravo Actual was completing their final approach to it, which was a narrow margin but a workable one if the LZ was clear, and if the threat picture had been suppressed, and if no new complications emerged. 3 conditions. She was currently working on the second one and had not yet evaluated the third. Copy 18 minutes. Keep this frequency clear, a half beat. Then Langley's voice dropped to the register she had learned over 15 years to hear as the one underneath the operational language, the register that carried what he meant, not just what he said. Junín 9. Watch the south wall. She was already turning toward the south wall, not because she had seen something there yet. Because she had been watching the south wall, the way you watched anything that had been quiet for too long, in a situation where quiet was not the natural state. The south face had given her the 2 movers, and then the mortar crew, and then 1 unaccounted mover, and then silence. And the silence had lasted long enough that it had stopped feeling like retreat, and started feeling like something else. Patience. The south wall was being patient, and patience in a tactical context meant waiting for the right moment, which meant the right moment had not yet arrived, which meant something was coming that required a specific moment to be effective, and that moment had not happened yet, and whatever was waiting on the south wall was waiting for it. She expanded her scan, full sweep, canyon floor, both ridge lines, the boulder fields, the shadow pockets she had catalogued on the approach, and on the third sweep, at the altitude Langley's message had prompted her to adjust to, she found them, 3 heat signatures, not on the ridge line, lower, tucked into a natural alcove where the south wall met a secondary rock formation that jutted outward from the main face at a 40-degree angle, creating a pocket that was effectively invisible from any standard approach angle. You needed to be at her exact altitude with her exact heading and her particular reason for looking. Langley's specific caution about the south wall, to see inside that pocket. She had almost not looked, almost. She pulled her targeting display to the 3 signatures and ran the geometry, and understood, in the way that understanding sometimes arrived. Not gradually, not piece by piece, but all at once. The completed picture assembling from the accumulated pieces she had been collecting, since the first pass. What she was actually looking at. The angle of those 3 positions relative to the canyon floor below, relative to the eastern LZ shelf, where Bravo Actual was currently moving, relative to the airspace immediately above that shelf where a Chinook would need to hold during extraction of 6 personnel, at least 2 of whom were non-mobile and would require time to load. Those 3 positions were not aimed at the ground team. They were aimed at the aircraft that would arrive to extract the ground team. And the understanding that followed that observation was worse than the observation itself, because the mortar crew on the canyon floor had not been optimally positioned to kill Bravo Actual. It had been positioned to keep them pinned. The RPG team on the northeast ridgeline had not been covering the approach to threaten an infantry advance. It had been covering the airspace above the approach to threaten aircraft. The 2 movers on the south face had not been moving toward Bravo Actual's position. They had been moving toward a secondary observation point that had better sightlines on the LZ. Every element of the engagement tonight had been positioned not to destroy the ground team, to keep them in the canyon, to keep them there until the aircraft sent to extract them could be destroyed. Which meant whoever had sent that ground team into Ridgeback Canyon without knowing what was in it, without clearing the area, without drone reconnaissance, without an accurate threat assessment, had sent them into something designed not to kill them immediately, but to use them as bait, as the specific inducement required to bring aircraft into a canyon that had already demonstrated its ability to consume aircraft. Someone wanted aircraft in Ridgeback Canyon. She filed this in the place where she was keeping everything that didn't fit the simple explanation, which was getting crowded, and returned her attention to the 3 positions on the south wall, and the Chinooks that were now 16 minutes out. Bravo Actual, Stormcaller, go ahead. Do not stop moving here, whatever happens. Do not stop. Copy. What is your current ETA to the LZ? 7 minutes, maybe less. I need 5. A pause that had weight in it. We'll give you 5, the voice said. She rolled hard left and came around toward the south wall, with the cannon armed and the targeting solution building, and 14 minutes remaining before the Chinooks arrived, and everything she needed to do before then, arranged in the order she needed to do it. The first alcove position required an angle she had not used before tonight, not in training, not in the previous 2 times she had flown this canyon. The natural alcove where the 3 heat signatures were positioned sat recessed from the main south face, in a way that made it geometrically inaccessible from most approach vectors. The rock formation jutting outward at 40 degrees created a physical barrier to direct fire from any altitude above 200 feet, and any heading within 40 degrees of standard. To reach it, she needed to come down the south face at 115 feet on a heading that put her nearly parallel to the wall itself, close enough that the gap between her right wingtip and the rock would be measured in meters rather than tens of meters, and hold that line for 3 seconds while the cannon did what it needed to do. She had mapped this angle mentally during the second pass, while she was running the threat geometry. She had not known then that she would need it. She had mapped it because mapping available angles was what she did in terrain like this, cataloging options before she needed them, so that when she needed them the decision was already made. She set the heading 115 feet. The right wing came close to the south face. She felt the air pressure change as the gap compressed, a subtle alteration in the aircraft's handling, as the ground effect interacted with the wall effect, and the resulting aerodynamic environment became something that the aircraft's designers had not specifically anticipated, not dangerous, not unmanageable, but different from free air and different in the specific ways she had expected, based on what she knew about how the south wall's geometry would affect airflow at this altitude and this angle. She had expected it. She managed it. The cannon fired 3 seconds, clean. The alcove position, which was not an alcove anymore so much as a statement about what happened. When you set up a fire position in terrain that someone understood better than you had accounted for, produced 2 signatures that scattered, and one that didn't. She pulled up and came around, second position. She was establishing the approach angle when the warning arrived. Not from an instrument, not from a cockpit alert, from somewhere below the level of conscious processing, in the register where pilots who had spent enough hours in threat environments developed sensory responses that science explained as accumulated pattern recognition, and that felt, in the moment, like something more immediate than that, the acoustic signature of a targeting system acquiring. She broke left and deployed a flare. The heat seeker followed the flare's thermal bloom rather than the engine heat, and detonated against the Eastern Canyon wall in a flash that lit the interior of Ridgeback for 2 seconds, and then went dark, leaving the afterimage burning in her peripheral vision. 1 flare down, 1 remaining. She reset the approach second position. She came in at 125 feet, a slightly higher angle, the geometry different from the first position, because the second position was set back further into the shadow pocket and required a different solution. The cannon fired. The second signature went dark, 1 position remaining. She checked fuel, 38%. Left engine holding at amber with the constancy of a complaint that had been making itself heard long enough to become background. The stabilizer running at the upper edge of what she was characterizing as manageable, which meant she was updating her characterization of manageable in real time. She set up for the third position, locked the approach angle, and the third position fired first. Not at her at the LZ. She saw it leave the south wall, the specific brightness of a launch signature in the near dark, the streak of light climbing at exactly the angle she had calculated when she first identified these positions, aimed at exactly the airspace above the eastern shelf, where Bravo Actual was currently arriving, where they were standing in the open, looking up at the sound of rotors that was still 13 minutes away, 4 seconds to impact, maybe 5. The calculation was immediate. She was not close enough to intercept the missile's path between the launch point and the LZ. She could not put ironclad between the weapon and the target in the time available. She could not destroy the launcher. She was already past the optimal firing angle and would need to reverse course, and she did not have time to reverse course. What she had was the missile's guidance system, and what the missile's guidance system wanted: heat. The most concentrated heat source in the available environment. She pushed both throttles to maximum power, both engines, full demand. The left engine temperature warning went from amber to orange to red in the course of 4 seconds, which was how long it took to accelerate to the speed she needed, and she noted it the way she had noted everything else tonight. Logged, filed, managed, not reacted to. Because reacting to it required attention she was currently spending on flying directly across the missile's acquisition cone. The heat seeker saw her engines. The calculation it performed was the calculation she had designed it to perform. Her engine heat signature was greater than the ambient temperature of the LZ shelf, greater than anything else in the canyon. The missile adjusted its track and followed her. Internal voice. Flat. Arriving in the space between one breath and the next, missile on acquisition. No flares. 1 remaining, but first-generation countermeasures won't hold a modern seeker for more than a second, which buys you nothing useful. So flares aren't the solution. What's the solution? The canyon, specifically the part of the canyon that you have been carrying in your head for 18 years because Daniel told you once. Standing in the backyard in Reno, with a topographic map spread across the table, that you should never fly terrain and then forget it. That terrain was the kind of knowledge that was permanent if you paid attention, and useless if you didn't. That one day you would fly through something and need to remember it, and you would either have remembered it or you wouldn't, and the difference would matter. The western end. The rock formation where the main canyon wall curves back on itself in the last 100 meters before the exit. The thermal pocket it creates, a localized anomaly where the rock's heat retention characteristics produce a warm air zone that exists nowhere else in the canyon. You noted it 18 years ago. You noted it again 8 months ago on the second pass. You filed it both times in the category of information whose utility is not yet apparent. Its utility is now apparent. Go west, full throttle. The missile behind her, closing. The pressure differential of its proximity. Something she could measure not with instruments, but with the specific change in how the air felt around the aircraft. A term she would not have used in a technical briefing, and which was the most accurate description available. She flew west. The canyon walls moved past at a speed that left no margin for assessment. There was only the line she had chosen, and the aircraft following the line, and the missile following the aircraft, and the distance to the western wall. Counting down in the calculation, she was running continuously. 500 meters. The left engine was red, fully red, running. But the margin between running and not running at maximum power demand was a margin she was aware of and was choosing not to think about specifically, because thinking about it required allocating attention she could not spare. And the consequence of it going wrong was something that would resolve itself one way or another without her needing to think about it. 200 meters. The missile was close. The pressure change had become something physical, a displacement she could feel in the airframe, the aircraft registering the proximity of the object, pursuing it the way a large body of water registered the approach of weather point 100 meters. She held the heading 550 meters. She pulled vertical, everything Ironclad had. Both engines at maximum continuous demand, the aircraft rotating from level flight to near vertical climb in the tightest arc the airframe's structural limits allowed, and then past those limits slightly, because the limits were conservative and she was not, and the margin between conservative and conservative plus was a margin she had spent 30 years learning to calculate. The missile could not make that turn. The physics of it were unambiguous. A heat-seeking weapon at terminal velocity did not have the angular authority to follow a target from level flight to vertical climb at that range. It tracked the heat for as long as the trajectory was within its guidance capability, and then the western wall curved, and the thermal pocket redirected its seeker input by a fraction of a degree, and a fraction was everything. The missile impacted the western wall of Ridgeback Canyon at a point approximately 30 feet below, where Ironclad had just been. The explosion was large. The shock wave took the aircraft from below and behind simultaneously. A compression that hit the fuselage and the wing surfaces and the control surfaces all at once, pitching Ironclad forward, and left with a violence that had nothing to do with the controlled forces she had been managing for the past 40 minutes, and everything to do with raw physics making its presence known. She corrected. The aircraft pitched again. She corrected again. Harder, the stabilizer now beyond argumentative, and into something she was managing entirely through manual input. The feedback loop between her hands and the control surfaces, and the aircraft's actual position in space, stripped of its automated assistance, and running on what she had instead, which was 30 years of accumulated physical knowledge about how A-10 Warthogs behaved when they were at the edge of their design envelope and being asked to perform anyway. The left engine coughed. A sound she had never heard from an A-10, a mechanical sound that should not have been possible from a turbofan engine, and which was, in the moment, the most alarming sound she had heard all night. Then it settled, rough, diminished. Output at somewhere between 50 and 60%, the gauge fluctuating in a range she was reading as. Still running, demand carefully. She leveled at 290 feet, ran the instrument check in order of operational relevance. Left engine, red, reduced output but functional. Right engine, amber, elevated temperature but within range. Fuel 29% stabilizer. She stopped reading the stabilizer, because it had passed the point where the instrument was providing actionable information and was now simply adding noise to a situation that had enough noise. She knew what the stabilizer was doing. She was managing it manually. That was the relevant fact. Structural integrity, the aircraft was flying. That was the number. She turned back toward the LZ. The Chinooks were 6 minutes out when she cleared the western section and came back through the canyon toward the eastern shelf. She flew the return at 170 feet, scanning both ridgelines, both canyon walls, the floor, the shadow pockets. Nothing moved, which might mean the threat was cleared, or might mean something was making a new calculation about whether to act before the extraction was complete. She flew anyway, continued the scan, gave everything that remained on the canyon walls, the clearest possible view of an A-10 Warthog, still airborne and still looking, because presence was its own deterrent, because the knowledge that the aircraft above you was watching and had already proven it would act was sometimes enough, and sometimes enough was what you had and you used it. Bravo Actual, Stormcaller. LZ status, a pause. We're at the shelf. All 6 personnel, another pause, shorter, the western wall. Problem resolved, she said. What's your wounded status? 1 critical, condition stable for now. 2 walking wounded. We are ready for extraction. Birds are 6 minutes out. I'll be overhead, Stormcaller, the voice. She had been not listening to it all night, had been conducting the operational portions of the exchange, position reports, threat information, timing, and had been not listening to everything underneath the operational language, the specific frequency of it, the controlled flatness that she had identified as disciplined and had not examined further, because examining it further was not something she could do while she was managing a left engine and a deteriorating stabilizer and a 3-position threat on the south wall. Now with the Chinook 6 minutes out, and the canyon quiet, and the fuel at 29%, and the immediate tactical picture as clear as it was going to get, she was running out of reasons not to hear it. Aircraft 1 Neen, flat, the operational voice, but with something underneath it that was rising. I need to ask you something. Bravo, this is not. You're flying a 19, she said nothing. I know the number. I've known that number since I was old enough to know what the number meant. She looked at the canyon walls moving past, the dust still settling from the western face. The shelf ahead where 6 shapes were arranged in the position of a team that had come through something and was still on the right side of it. The rotors of the Chinooks were audible now. 4 minutes. Maybe 3. Is it you? The voice said. Not a question. The grammatical form of a question, but the weight of something that already knew. She held the heading, scanned the ridgelines one more time. Nothing. Get your people ready to load, she said. A silence that lasted 3 seconds. Mom. 1 word. She closed her eyes for the duration of 1 breath, which was longer than she should have allowed herself, at 180 feet on reduced engine, manually managing a compromised stabilizer, with Chinooks inbound and an LZ to cover. She allowed it anyway. Get your people ready to load, Sergeant, she said. Another silence. Yes, ma'am. She flew cover over the eastern shelf while the first Chinook descended. She made 2 passes over the ridgelines, scanned the south wall, found nothing that moved. The loading proceeded. Non-mobile personnel first, the systematic efficiency of a team that had trained for this, even though nobody trained specifically for this. For being hurt and loading wounded teammates into a hovering aircraft in a canyon that had been trying to hold them for the past 4 hours. She counted 5 in, 1 on the shelf. Standing, looking up. She couldn't read his expression from this altitude and this light. She could only read the posture, the stillness of it, the specific quality of someone who had somewhere to be and had decided to take 1 more moment before going there. The crew chief at the Chinook door was clearly communicating something urgent. The figure on the shelf didn't move. Bravo Actual. Board the aircraft. Nothing, Sergeant. Board the aircraft now. A pause that lasted long enough to have a texture. Are you coming back 29% fuel? Left engine at reduced output. Red asking questions she was not answering yet. Stabilizer manual. The return flight to Nellis was 31 miles. She had made the math work in worse conditions. Probably. I always come back, she said. He boarded. She watched the first Chinook lift. Banked right to give it clearance. Made 1 final pass. The last thing she had to do before she could turn for home was confirmed that the canyon had nothing left to say about the Chinooks or the personnel they were carrying. She flew the final pass slow and deliberate. Both ridgelines, both canyon walls, the floor, the shadow pockets she had catalogued clean. And then, in the final seconds before she reached the canyon exit, the rock opening to desert ahead of her. She looked at the south ridgeline one more time. Above the alcove positions she had cleared, a figure, standing in the open, not crouching behind the remaining cover, not moving toward the canyon exit, not doing anything that tactics or self-preservation would have suggested. Just standing with arms at sides, fully upright, in a position with a clear sight line to the departing aircraft, watching. She pulled the thermal display, human signature, unambiguous, deliberate posture, not equipment, not geology. A person standing on the south ridgeline of Ridgeback Canyon after everything that had happened tonight, watching her leave. Not one of the hostile force. The hostile force had been positioned, had moved, had fired, had sustained casualties. This figure had none of that behavioral profile. This figure had been in a position to observe the entire engagement from entry to exit. This figure had been watching, just watching. She flew through the canyon exit. The desert opened around her. The GPS came back. The navigation systems normalized. The sky went wide again. The full Nevada night spread in every direction, the horizon reappearing where it was supposed to be. And ironclad, left engine red and rough, stabilizer manual, fuel at 27%, and the math between here and Nellis narrow but not impossible. The airframe carrying the accumulated evidence of a night that should have gone differently in several respects and had not. Ironclad flew home. In the first Chinook, Sergeant Theodore Voss sat against the interior wall, with his shoulder in a field dressing, and the sound of the rotors filling the cabin, and his eyes closed. The team was quiet around him, with the quiet of people who had used everything they had and were running on what was left. Someone put a headset in his hand. He didn't open his eyes, felt for the frequency selector by touch, found it, adjusted it, and listened. 2 turbofan engines at partial load, one rough, one strained, together producing the specific sound signature of an aircraft that was doing what it was being asked to do despite having reasons not to, carrying itself through the dark toward a runway 31 miles away. Underneath the engine noise, faint, the sound of her breathing, steady, even still working. He sat back against the Chinook wall, and for the first time in 4 hours let his hands unclench. The approach to Nellis was the loneliest 31 miles Della Voss had flown in recent memory. Not because of the silence on the radio, though the radio was quiet. Not because of the dark, though the Nevada night outside the canopy was the specific moonless dark of high desert country, with nothing between the ground and the stars to soften the distance. It was lonely in the way that the return leg of a hard mission was always lonely. The particular solitude of a cockpit after the thing was over, when the tactical demand that had been occupying every available part of your brain for the last hour and 40 minutes was no longer making its claims on you, and the space it left behind filled up, gradually, and then all at once, with everything you had not been allowing yourself to think about. She managed the left engine. That was the immediate task. The left engine was running at somewhere between 52 and 58% output. The gauge fluctuating in that range with the indecisiveness of a system that was making its own calculations about how much it had left. And the right engine was compensating, running warmer than nominal to carry the load, and the fuel was at 24%, and the math between 24% and Nellis was the kind of math that resolved into a positive answer if you ran it straight, and a negative one if you added any complications. She ran it straight, no deviations from the direct course. No altitude changes that would burn additional fuel. The stabilizer was manual, and would remain manual for the duration. She had stopped reading the gauge 40 minutes ago, and was flying it entirely through her hands now. The constant micro-adjustments so habitual at this point, that they had joined the background of the flight rather than demanding foreground attention. She thought about the figure on the south ridgeline, standing in the open after everything that had occurred in that canyon tonight, not retreating, not doing anything tactically coherent at all, just standing and watching with the specific stillness of someone for whom observation was the objective. She had been in enough situations where someone wanted to be seen to know the difference between a person who was present in a place and a person who was present in a place for the purpose of being noticed. That figure had wanted to be seen by her. She filed it with everything else she had been collecting tonight and would need to examine later, when later was available. When the aircraft was on the ground and the fuel situation was resolved, and her son was in a medical bay having his shoulder properly assessed. Her son, she had not allowed herself to think the words fully until now, had held them at the edge of processing all night, accessible enough to inform the decisions that required the information, but not fully admitted to the part of her mind where things were felt rather than used. Her son had been in Ridgeback Canyon. Her son had been there for 4 hours before she arrived. Her son had been the voice on the radio saying, "I wasn't sure anyone was coming, and you're flying all one time," and finally, standing on the LZ shelf while the Chinook crew chief made increasingly urgent gestures from the door, "Are you coming back?" She permitted herself, at 180 feet over the Nevada desert with Nellis, 19 miles ahead, to understand the full weight of that. Not for long, not indulgently. Just long enough to acknowledge it as the thing it was, which was the thing she had been carrying all night in the compartment. She kept for things that couldn't be processed while they were needed as fuel. Then she put it back in the compartment, because the aircraft needed her hands, and the landing needed her attention, and the 24% fuel situation needed her arithmetic, and she could open the compartment later when she could afford to. Nellis appeared ahead as light. The base spread across the desert floor in the grid pattern of a purpose-built installation, the runway lights marking the approach with the reassuring geometry of a known quantity. She had landed here hundreds of times. She knew this runway the way she knew Ironclad. By its personality, by its idiosyncrasies, by the specific crosswind tendency on the northern threshold that you had to account for if you were coming in from the east. She was coming in from the east. She keyed the radio. "Tower, aircraft 19, 3 miles on final, emergency landing. Left engine degraded, fuel critical. Request emergency services standing by." A pause from the tower that was shorter than she expected. 19, runway 21 is clear, emergency services rolling. Wind is calm. "You are cleared to land." The voice on the frequency was Wick's. She recognized it. Of course it was Wick. Of course he had stayed. She set up the approach, steeper than standard. The left engine didn't have the reserves for a long, shallow glide path, and landing long with 21% fuel remaining. And a degraded engine was a calculation she was not interested in making. She came in with a sink rate that would have generated a call-out in training, and which was tonight the correct technique. The wheels hit at the 1/3 point on the runway hard, left side first, because the left engine's reduced thrust was creating an asymmetric condition that she was managing but not eliminating. And the first contact with the runway expressed that asymmetry in the aircraft's tendency to veer left on touchdown. She caught it with right rudder. The nose gear came down at an angle that was going to produce documentation. The aircraft shuddered through the initial ground roll, with the announcement of something that had been through an evening and was not pretending otherwise. She braked harder than the manual recommended. The manual's recommendations assumed an aircraft in standard configuration, which Ironclad was not, and a pilot with standard fuel reserves, which she did not have, and a runway with a normal stopping distance available, which she was not interested in using more of than necessary. Ironclad stopped 40 meters from the runway's end. She sat in the cockpit for 22 seconds. She knew exactly how long because she was counting, not for any operational reason. Because she needed the 22 seconds for her hands to stop doing what they were doing, which was a fine tremor in the fingers of her left hand that had begun approximately 30 seconds after the missile detonated against the western wall, which was, she noted, approximately 30 seconds after the tactical situation had resolved sufficiently to permit the tremor to exist. The body had its own schedule for these things. She had learned not to argue with the schedule, and to simply wait for it to complete, which it did. At 22 seconds, then she shut down the engines, right engine first. The instruments dropping in sequence as the systems powered down, the cockpit going from the information-dense environment of active flight to the relative quiet of a machine at rest. Then the left engine, which shut down with a roughness that was its final editorial comment on the evening, a sound that she made note of for Alderman's benefit. She opened the canopy. The Nevada night came in, cold, absolute. The desert's version of a temperature change, not a gradual cooling, but an immediate renegotiation. The insulated warmth of the cockpit replaced in seconds by air that had been sitting at 4,000 feet above sea level, with nothing to hold its heat since sundown. She climbed out without waiting for the ladder, stepped down to the wing, then to the tarmac. The ground crew was coming. She could see the lights moving toward her from the maintenance area, Alderman among them, she was certain, moving with the speed of someone for whom the sight of du unseen, landing with a rough left engine and a steeper-than-standard approach, was information requiring immediate physical presence. Emergency vehicles were rolling from the far side of the field, their lights making red and blue patterns on the tarmac that served no navigational purpose, and which was simply the visual language of institutional concern. She walked away from the aircraft in the direction that was neither toward the incoming crew nor toward the emergency vehicles. Parallel to both, down the tarmac in the direction of the far hangar lights, because there was something she needed before the debrief, before the documentation, before the men in civilian clothes who were almost certainly already waiting somewhere on this base. She turned left at the edge of the apron. He was standing 40 meters away, field dressing on his left shoulder, the white of the bandage visible against his dark uniform in the hangar lights. No helmet, no rifle, just Theo, 27 years old and alive, and standing on the tarmac with the stillness of someone who had decided to be exactly where he was for as long as was required. She stopped walking, 40 meters between them. She had delivered news to families before, had stood in rooms and said the words that rearranged people's worlds, and she had done it with the specific care that the task required, because she understood what it cost and what it owed to the people receiving it. She had been the recipient of news like that once herself, at 26, and she understood from the inside what it did to the geometry of a moment. This was not that. This was the opposite of that. And yet the distance between them had the same quality of weight. Because for 4 hours she had been flying toward the version of this moment where it was possible. And the version where it was not possible had also been available. And standing here with 40 meters of tarmac between her and her son who was alive and standing up, she was fully aware of both versions simultaneously. He walked toward her. The same walk. Her walk. She had noticed it when he was 19 and it had startled her. Not the physical similarity, which she'd been aware of for years, but the quality beneath the physical. The decision embedded in the pace. The sense of someone who had already done the thinking and was now simply executing. She didn't move. He covered the 40 meters and stopped in front of her. And then his right arm came around her. Carefully, the left shoulder not available for the purpose. And the carefulness of the accommodation was its own kind of information about who he was, and she let him, which was not her default. Della Voss had a professional exterior she had maintained for 30 years, with the consistency of scheduled maintenance, because it was a structural element, and structural elements required upkeep, and because the alternative, the version where the exterior was not maintained, was a version she had examined and decided against. Not from fear of what it contained. From understanding that what it contained was hers, and that hers meant private, and that private was not the same as hidden, but Theo was not professional. Theo was the one person in the world for whom the exterior had always been optional, because he had never been fooled by it, and she had never seriously tried to fool him, and so the maintenance had always been somewhat performative in his presence anyway. So she let him. They stood on the tarmac in the shadow of a battered A-10 and said nothing. It lasted 30 seconds, maybe 40, long enough to constitute the thing it was, which was two people acknowledging, without language, what the night had been, and what it had almost been and what it was now. Then she stepped back, looked at his shoulder, at the field dressing, at the way he was holding the arm, slightly elevated, slightly away from his body, the unconscious adjustment of someone managing pain without drawing attention to it. "How bad?" she said. "Muscle damage. The bone is intact. They told me that in the bird, and the others, Harris is in surgery. The critical case. They say he's going to make it." He paused. Probably is better than the alternative. Yes. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. The specific quality of looking that they had developed between them over 27 years. The kind that carried more information than most people's conversations. "Go get the shoulder properly addressed," she said. "I'm fine." That was not a question. He almost argued. She saw him consider it. The familiar sequence of him deciding whether this was a situation where arguing was productive, which he had been running since he was approximately 14, and arriving at the same conclusion he usually arrived at when she used that particular tone. "And you," he said, "I'll find you when I'm done." She turned toward the two men she had seen at the edge of the hangar when she first crossed the apron. He hadn't noticed them, she had. She walked toward them. She did not look back. The drive took 11 minutes. She knew because she counted those too, for the same reason she had counted the 22 seconds in the cockpit. Not obsessively. Just because counting was something her brain did when it was managing the transition between one kind of attention and another. The interval between a tactical situation and whatever came next. 2 security checkpoints. The first with standard base credentials, which the driver presented. The second with a clearance level that had nothing to do with her suspended credentials or the driver's standard identification. A biometric verification and a code sequence that took 45 seconds and which had clearly been arranged in advance, which meant these checkpoints had been notified before she landed, which meant someone had known she was coming back before she was back, which meant someone had known she was going in. She added this to the collection. The building was low and set back from the main installation in the way of structures that had been placed where they were specifically to avoid casual visibility. No exterior windows she could identify from the approach. The footprint suggested a layout that prioritized internal space over exterior presentation, which was the architectural philosophy of places that understood their function, required no advertisement. She had seen it from a distance before, had registered it and filed it in the category of base infrastructure, whose specific purpose she had not been told and had not asked about, because there were buildings on any major installation that fell into that category, and asking about them was generally unproductive. Inside, corridor. Neutral lighting at the level that provided adequate visibility without creating atmosphere. The kind of lighting chosen by people who understood that environment communicated, and who wanted this environment to communicate nothing in particular. 2 lefts and a right, which she mapped automatically, the conference room at the end of the corridor, 1 long table. 2 chairs positioned across from each other, rather than at the same side, which was the arrangement of a conversation that expected some tension. A photograph on the wall. Nevada desert at dawn, the kind of image that was either generic decor or a deliberate choice, and in a building like this was unlikely to be generic anything. No recording equipment visible on the table or mounted on the walls, which was information about how this conversation was intended to exist afterward. A single folder at the center of the table closed. At the table, a woman. Della read her in the time it took to cross from the door to the chair. 61. The specific age was an estimate, but she was confident in it to within 2 years either direction, not from visible aging, which was a poor indicator, but from the way the woman occupied the room. There was a quality to how people sat in spaces that accumulated over decades and became readable if you had spent enough years in rooms where reading people quickly was operationally relevant. This woman sat with the authority of someone who had stopped performing authority long enough ago, that what remained was simply its natural expression. Silver-grey hair worn short, in the way of someone who had made a permanent decision about practicality over presentation. a suit that was expensive without announcing itself. Reading glasses set aside on the table to her left. She had been waiting long enough to have been doing something. She did not stand when Della entered, which could mean several things. Della sat down and waited to find out which thing it meant. Major Voss, you have the advantage, Della said. You know my name, Gwen Hardcastle. No title, no organizational affiliation. Just the name, delivered as if it were sufficient, which in Della's experience meant it was. Sit down, I am sitting. Hardcastle looked at her for a moment. The look of someone running a final comparison between a long-accumulated expectation and the thing that had just arrived to either confirm or revise it. Then she said, I flew F-111s for 9 years. Della waited. Then I was informed that the cockpit ergonomics weren't optimized for my physical profile. A pause calibrated to let the statement sit without assistance. That was the official language. I'm familiar with how official language works. I know you are. Hardcastle folded her hands on the table. I've been watching your file for 18 years. Since the first time you flew Ridgeback, the number landed, teen years. Della was 34 the first time she flew Ridgeback. She was 52 now. The arithmetic was immediate and exact, and what it produced was the understanding that this woman had been watching her for more than a third of her life. Not recently, not since the Pruitt situation, but since a training exercise 18 years ago that had produced a flight controller's note, and apparently something else, the evaluation exercise, Della said. You were the only pilot to complete the low-altitude corridor run, below 200 feet, no instrument assist, full canyon length. Hardcastle touched the closed folder without opening it. The exercise controller wrote in his report. Pilot appears to be operating on information not available to other participants. That's one characterization. Give me yours. Della considered how to answer. Not because the answer was complicated. Because the answer involved Daniel, and she was selective about when and how she allowed Daniel into conversations with people she was still evaluating. My brother taught me to read terrain, she said. Not to look at it, to listen to it. He understood that ground communicated if you paid the right kind of attention. Wind over rock sounds different than wind over sand. Pressure changes at canyon entrances have signatures. He could walk into a space once and tell you things about it that took everyone else multiple visits to understand. And you learned that from him. I've been practicing it for 30 years. Why did Pruitt ground you? The shift was abrupt, deliberate. She was testing whether Della's attention was consistent across topic changes, or whether she had performance modes for different subjects. Della noted this. His corridor approach put our aircraft in a threat envelope for 11 seconds, that an alternative route eliminated entirely. I said so in a briefing where 23 people heard it. He had the authority to respond to that, knowing what it would cost you. The cost wasn't the variable I was solving for. Hardcastle was quiet for a moment. Not the calculating quiet of someone deciding what to say, the quieter quiet of someone who had just heard something they already knew and were experiencing the confirmation of it. No, she said. I don't suppose it was. She opened the folder. The satellite image was date-stamped 6 months ago. Ridgeback Canyon from directly above. Resolution high enough to show individual rock formations on the canyon walls. The shadows cast by afternoon light giving the image a three-dimensional quality that flat photography rarely achieved. Della leaned forward without deciding to. The image produced the lean as an involuntary response, the way a specific kind of information produced a specific kind of attention. Along the south wall, in the shadow of the secondary rock formation that jutted outward from the main face at 40 degrees. The same formation behind which she had found the 3 heat signatures tonight. Structures, not geological, constructed. The geometry was wrong for natural formation. Too regular, too deliberate, the corners too close to right angles. The kind of geometry that required intention and planning, and materials brought from outside the canyon. The kind that took time. How long has this been here? She said. The earliest imagery showing construction activity is 14 months old. 14 months, the week Pruitt had filed the grounding order. She did not say this aloud. She looked at Hardcastle. Hardcastle looked back. The shared recognition of two people who had noticed the same thing from different vantage points. Bravo Actual's mission, Della said, was reconnaissance of those structures. They didn't know that. They were given a cover objective. Standard Protocol 4. They went in without knowing what they were looking for, Della said. Flat, not heated. The way she delivered information that was uncomfortable for the room, or what was protecting it, or that it existed at all. They went in blind into terrain that has already consumed 2 drones, against a force of unknown size and training level, with a threat assessment that was. She paused. Wrong, yes, Hardcastle said. Not the assessment reflected available intelligence. Not the parameters were within acceptable risk thresholds. Not any of the official language that distributed responsibility until it became unattributable. Yes, sat at that for a moment. In her experience, people in rooms like this one said yes like that approximately never. The fact that Hardcastle had said it, simply, without qualification, without the protective architecture of bureaucratic phrasing, was information about who Hardcastle was that no amount of file research would have produced. The force that engaged Bravo Actual, Della said. They were trained, yes, not locally, not improvised. The positioning was doctrine. The fallback patterns were rehearsed. We have no matching profiles in any federal, military, or allied database. Facial recognition is running on thermal imagery from tonight. Nothing yet. They weren't trying to kill the team, Della said. The mortar crew on the canyon floor was positioned to pin, not to destroy. The RPG coverage on the northeast ridgeline was angled for airspace, not infantry. The 3 positions on the south wall were set up to engage extraction aircraft. We reached the same assessment from the satellite coverage. Someone wanted those soldiers in that canyon, wanted them there when the extraction aircraft arrived. She paused. Someone wanted aircraft in Ridgeback. Yes, Hardcastle said again. Why? Hardcastle placed a second item on the table. A photograph, thermal imaging, time-stamped from tonight, pulled from what she identified as an orbiting platform. South ridgeline, above the alcove positions, and on the ridgeline a figure, standing, arms at sides. The posture she had seen from the cockpit in the final seconds before the canyon exit. We did not put this person there, Hardcastle said. They are not part of any authorized operation in Ridgeback Canyon tonight. They appear in no operational order we have access to. Della looked at the photograph. The thermal image was clear enough to be unambiguous. Human, standing upright, not engaging, not retreating, not doing anything tactically coherent. Present for the purpose of observation. You've seen this before, she said. 3 previous incidents over 4 years, different locations, different operational contexts. Same posture, same behavior, always one individual. Always with a direct sightline to the primary aircraft in the engagement. Always my aircraft. The first 2 incidents predate your involvement. The third, Hardcastle paused with the precision of someone choosing words in real time. The pilot in the 3rd incident wasn't you, but the flight profile was consistent with yours in several significant ways. Below standard minimum altitude, manual navigation in GPS-degraded conditions. Weapons employment without full targeting system support. Someone is watching for a specific way of flying, Della said. That's our current assessment. And you don't know who? No, Hardcastle said. Honest answer. Della looked at the photograph for a long moment. At the figure, standing on the ridgeline above the positions she had cleared. Above the canyon that had spent 4 hours trying to hold 6 people in it, watching the aircraft that had come to get them out. What do you want? She said. Hardcastle reached into the portfolio beside her chair and placed a single document on the table between them. 1 page, clean, short. The document of someone who understood that precision was not a function of length. Della read it, then read it again, the Ridgeback program. Formally established as of this morning. Investigation of restricted airspace anomalies and the unauthorized structures, activities, and personnel associated with them. Reporting structure going directly to Hardcastle's office, bypassing the standard chain of command. Operating authority to access any restricted airspace zone in the continental United States without prior coordination. A unit designation with no public existence in any database, and a title for the program's operational commander. Her name, Ironclad, she said. Aircraft Awinene will be fully restored and upgraded. The stabilizer will be replaced. The 2 offline targeting subsystems will be reinstated. Additional modifications at the discretion of the program. Langley. Colonel Langley's duty log from tonight has been reviewed and determined to be compliant with emergency authorization protocols. She understood what that meant. The document Langley had signed. The evaluation flight, the unidentified pilot, the careful language that was technically defensible and factually protective, had been retroactively validated by someone with the authority to validate it. Pruitt's ability to use it against Langley was now null. Pruitt, she said, the General's authority over your administrative review has been suspended, pending an investigation into the accuracy of the threat assessment used to justify Bravo Actual's mission parameters. Hardcastle's voice was entirely neutral. That investigation is expected to produce findings, Theo, she said. Sergeant Voss stays out of Ridgeback. Major, the program's scope will require. Deputy Director, she held Hardcastle's eyes. That is not a position I'm negotiating from. The room was quiet. Hardcastle performed her final calculation. Della could see it. Not the contents of it, but the process of it. The brief internal conference that happened behind eyes that were very still. Noted, she said. Della picked up the pen. She signed. Not because every question in the room was answered. Not because she trusted the program completely, or trusted Hardcastle without reservation, or had resolved the figure on the ridgeline into anything she understood. She signed because the alternative was the bench in the hangar, and page 47 and 30 more feet of distance between her and an aircraft that she had just demonstrated was not done flying. She pushed the document across the table. One more thing, Hardcastle said. She turned the document over. An attachment, a list, 6 names. Short, clean at the top, Sergeant Theodore Voss. Della looked at it. He submitted a transfer request to the program's training division 14 days ago, Hardcastle said. He was specific about something in the application. She turned to a page in the folder and read, I want to earn this without the name. Della looked at her son's name at the top of that list for a long moment, not with surprise. With recognition. When does training begin? She said. That's your decision now, Hardcastle said. You're the program commander. She found him sitting on a supply crate with his left arm in a temporary sling and a field ration protein bar in his right hand, eating it with the focused determination of someone who understood the body needed fuel and had decided not to have opinions about the source. The medical bay was a secondary facility, not the main hospital. A forward treatment room off the operations corridor, fluorescent and practical, smelling of antiseptic and the specific staleness of rooms that were used for emergencies and were empty between them. A corpsman had processed Theo's shoulder assessment and left him with discharge instructions and a follow-up appointment and the protein bar, which was the medical bay's version of a parting gift. He looked up when she came in. She pulled a second supply crate over and sat down across from him, not at a distance that required projecting, close enough that the conversation belonged to the room, which was empty except for them. How bad is it really? She said. The corpsman said significant muscle damage, no structural compromise. Mobility will be limited for 6 to 8 weeks. Physical therapy after that. And the pain managed. She looked at him. He looked back. You've been managing it since the canyon, she said. Not a question. We had things to do in the canyon. We did. He ate a piece of the protein bar. She watched him do it, and thought about the various contexts in which she had watched him eat over 27 years, and the specific distance between those contexts and this one, which was the distance between ordinary life and the night that had just occurred. And she thought about how those distances collapsed after you had been through something, how the before and the after ended up in the same room somehow. Why didn't you identify yourself? He said. On the radio. Would it have changed anything? He thought about it. Actually thought in the way he did when a question deserved the honest version of the answer rather than the immediate one. No, he said tactically. No. Then it wasn't relevant information during an active engagement. It was relevant to me. She looked at him. I know, she said. A pause. I used echo left on the south face, he said. Twice, both times it held, she had heard him use it. In the moment, she had absorbed it as tactical information. The confirmation that Bravo Actual was moving, that the team's navigation was intact, and had not allowed herself to hear everything underneath it, which was, "This is something you gave me, and it worked, and I am here because it worked." "I know," she said again. "I've used it 4 times total. It's worked every time." He looked at the protein bar. "I never told you that." "You didn't need to tell me. I'm telling you now." She sat with that for a moment. There was a quality to it, to the simple act of him saying, "I'm telling you now," that she found she needed a moment to receive properly. Not because it was complicated, because it was simple. Because it was the kind of thing that was easy to miss in the architecture of a relationship built between 2 people who were both constitutionally inclined to say less than they meant. "You didn't tell me about the transfer," she said. He was quiet. "6 months ago you called me on a Tuesday and said you were being reassigned. You didn't say where. I was going to. After I'd been there long enough that it was mine." He looked at her. "I spent a long time being the Major's son. I was good at it. I knew how to do it. But it was," he stopped. "Started again. I wanted something that started from me, not from you, not from the name." She nodded. "I understand that," she said. "You're not angry. No, that surprises you that I'm saying that. A little. You made a decision about your own career without asking me first. That's the correct behavior for a 27-year-old. She paused. "I would have done the same. You did do the same," he said. "Grandma told me about the training program at Davis. She said you called her from the plane because you didn't want to have the conversation before you'd already done it." She had forgotten that she had done that. Or had not forgotten, had simply filed it in the category of events that were complete and no longer required processing. "She told you that. When I was about 20. She thought it was relevant to my development. It was not her story to tell." "No," he said. "But she told it well." She looked at him. He was almost smiling. She came close to smiling back. Then she said, "There's something I need to tell you." He waited. The way he waited. The same quality of waiting she had. The stillness of someone who had learned that waiting was better than anticipating. "The program I signed tonight has a training division. I'm going to lead it. First class is 6 people." He was very still. "Your name is at the top of the list," she said. "You applied 14 days ago. Without telling me, a silence." "I was going to tell you," he said. "After I knew whether I'd been accepted." "After," she said, "after." They looked at each other across the space between the 2 supply crates. And what passed between them was the kind of recognition that didn't require language to be complete. 2 people who were built from similar material that had been shaped by different forces into different forms, arriving at the same place from different directions, which was perhaps the only way people like them ever arrived anywhere. "Is it going to be a problem?" he said. "You being the instructor, almost certainly. Are you going to be harder on me than the others?" "Without question," he nodded. The nod of someone who had expected this answer and found it on reflection acceptable. "The echo left," he said. "Is that in the curriculum? It is now," she said. She went back to the hangar at ZO 340, not for any operational reason. Not to check on anything that needed checking, or prepare for anything that was scheduled, or accomplish any task that the evening's business had left incomplete. She went because it was where she went, and because after a night like this one, the place you went was the place that had been the constant. And the constant for Della Voss for 30 years was the hangar and the aircraft in it. Hangar 4 at Nellis was quiet in the way of large spaces in the middle of the night. The kind of quiet that was not actually silence, but the accumulation of sounds too ambient to name individually. The ventilation system, the distant hum of the base's electrical infrastructure. The occasional creak of metal at the temperature differential between inside and outside. The kind of soundscape that was background rather than foreground, that said nothing is happening in the way that the absence of tactical noise said nothing is happening, which was a different kind of nothing than silence. Ironclad was under the overhang. The recovery crew had brought it in and positioned it with the care they brought to 019 specifically, which was slightly more care than they brought to other aircraft. She had noticed this over 14 months of watching them from 30 feet away. There was a quality to how the crew handled Ironclad that went beyond standard maintenance protocols. An attentiveness, a specificity. The aircraft had a reputation, and the people who worked on it had absorbed that reputation into the way they moved around it. The left engine nacelle was open. Panels removed. The damage assessment had begun, and the evidence of it was spread around the aircraft in the organized way of a professional team that had started something and would finish it at first light. The new panel gaps on the left flank, where tonight had taken something that would need to be replaced. Additional scratches that would need to be assessed for whether they were cosmetic or structural. More worn than before tonight, still 019. She walked to it, stood beside the fuselage and put her hand flat against the metal. The way she had stood in this hangar hundreds of times, in the years before the grounding and in the 14 months during it. The metal was cold. The desert had taken all the engine heat out of it in the hours since landing, which was what the desert did. It was efficient at removing things, at reducing temperatures to the ambient baseline, at returning things to the condition they maintained when no energy was being added. She kept her hand there anyway, on the maintenance cart at the nose, where Alderman had placed it when the recovery crew took over. She could tell it was Alderman's placement from the specific position, slightly offset from center in the way he placed things without seeming to think about it. The wristwatch. She picked it up. The cracked crystal caught the overhead light in the specific way it always caught light. The fracture line creating a small prismatic effect at its edges that she had stopped seeing consciously years ago, but which registered now tonight in the way things registered when attention had been forced to its finest point, and then released. She turned it over. The inscription on the back, she did not need to read it. She knew it the way she knew the hydraulic sequencing diagram on page 47. Not as information consulted, but as information present, always accessible, taking up no additional space because it had become part of the architecture. D. The sky belongs to those who learn its language. Fly it. Daniel He had given it to her the week before the accident. She had said she didn't want his old watch. He had said she would. He had been right. With the specific rightness of someone who understood that you couldn't always tell people what they would need until the moment the need arrived. And that the gap between the giving and the understanding was just time, and time was manageable. She buckled it onto her wrist. Then she looked up, past the open hangar doors, past the runway lights that were still on at this hour, past the perimeter fence that marked the edge of what Nellis was. At the Nevada sky, it was changing, not dawn yet. The eastern horizon was not light so much as less dark, the first indication that the absolute black of the desert night was a temporary condition rather than a permanent one, that somewhere on the other side of the Earth's rotation, there was a sun that was going to make its position known. The stars at the eastern edge were slightly less distinct than they had been an hour ago. The horizon slightly more defined, the sky in the condition that Daniel had always called the almost. The sky is either doing something or about to do something, he had said once, on a morning when they had been up before dawn, for reasons she could no longer remember. The almost is better than both. The almost is when you can see what's coming before it arrives. She had been thinking about him more tonight than she had allowed herself to in a long time. Not with the sharp grief of the first years. Not with the managed distance she had maintained for most of the 2 decades since. With something closer to conversation. The way you thought about people who had shaped the way you thought. Not as absence but as presence. The specific presence of ideas that had become your own through enough years of use that you could no longer always identify where they had come from. The echo left. That was his too, originally. She had adapted it, refined it for aerial application, built it into the vocabulary of her flying over 18 years. Theo had learned it from her, was using it tonight in a canyon in Nevada to keep himself and 5 other people alive. Daniel's way of thinking about terrain passed through her, now living in Theo. Which was not nothing. Which was, in fact, the most specific kind of something. She thought about the figure on the south ridgeline. She had been thinking about it in pieces all night, in the canyon, in the cockpit on the return flight, in the conference room with Hardcastle, in the medical bay with Theo, processing it in the background, the way you process things that were not yet ready to be processed in the foreground. 3 previous incidents over 4 years, different locations, same posture, watching for a specific way of flying rather than a specific aircraft or a specific person. Watching for Daniel's language. She didn't know if that was true. It was an inference built from limited data, and she held it loosely, the way she held all inferences, until she had enough information to hold them more firmly. But it was the inference that fit the available evidence most completely. And fitting available evidence was how you navigated when the navigation systems were offline. Someone knew about a way of flying that had originated with a man who died 26 years ago. Someone had been watching for it for 4 years. Someone had been watching for her, specifically, since the first time she flew Ridgeback Canyon and came out the other side. She did not know what they wanted. She knew they would show her eventually. And she knew, with the same certainty she knew terrain, the certainty that lived in the body before it arrived in the mind, that when they did, she would be in the air when it happened. She lowered her hand from the cold metal of the fuselage. She noticed, as she stepped back from the aircraft, the letters beneath the cockpit Storkum Cora. New paint, clean edges. Applied with the careful precision of someone who had done it in the hours since the aircraft was brought in, while she was in the conference room and the medical bay and the walk back across the tarmac. She looked toward the maintenance office. Through the glass, Alderman was at his desk, bent over the damage assessment documentation, pen moving. He was not looking up. She looked at the name on the aircraft. She had been Stormcaller on the radio for a long time, the call sign that had accumulated its own history through the years, that had meant something different at different points in that history, and meant something again tonight. But seeing it painted on the aircraft, below the cockpit, where she would see it every time she climbed in, was a different thing. It was the kind of permanence that happened when a name stopped belonging to a single event and started belonging to the person it had been given to. She said nothing, because some acknowledgements didn't require language. She went to the bench, picked up the technical manual, page 47, read it for the last time, then she closed it, set it flat on the workbench, smoothed the cover with her palm once, the way you smoothed the cover of something you were finished with. Not discarding, finishing. The difference mattered. Page 47 was the hydraulic sequencing diagram for an aircraft that wasn't flying. Ironclad was going to fly again. The stabilizer would be replaced. The targeting subsystems reinstated. The left engine assessed and repaired or replaced, according to what the damage assessment found when the light came up, and Alderman's team went to work. The new panel gaps patched and painted. All of it bringing the aircraft back from tonight to the condition that tomorrow required. Not the same condition as before tonight, different. The way things were different after being tested at the edge of what they could do. Stronger in the specific places where strength had been asked for, carrying the record of the test in the small ways that records accumulated in metal and hydraulics, and the particular wear patterns that experience left in everything it touched. She would be the same way. She walked to the hangar entrance and stood in the opening between the inside and the outside, between the oil and metal smell of the hangar and the cold, clean air of the pre-dawn Nevada desert, and looked at the sky, which was at Zofo 412, doing the thing it did at this hour, getting ready, not light yet, but accumulating the conditions for light. The eastern horizon now definitively less dark than the rest of the sky, the change proceeding with the patience of things that knew they didn't need to hurry because they were inevitable. She had 6 students to train, one of whom was going to be more difficult to train than the other 5, not because he was less capable. He was possibly the most capable of them, though she would not have told him this at this stage, and possibly not at any stage, because Voss family pride was a structural element that could support weight but was not improved by additional loading. But because teaching someone who learned the way you learned required you to know the difference between what you knew because you had been taught, and what you knew because you had been taught by the terrain itself, and that distinction was not always clear even to you. She had never taught anyone to fly the way she flew. She had never been asked to. She was being asked now. The sky continued its preparations. Delavos stood in the hangar entrance and watched it do what it was going to do regardless, which was arrive, and thought about what the next version of this looked like, the program, the training. The figure on the ridgeline who had been watching for 4 years, and would be watching again, in a different canyon, the next time she went somewhere that was like Ridgeback, somewhere the navigation systems failed, and the instruments were insufficient. And what we had instead was memory, and the knowledge that Daniel had given her, and that she had given Theo, and that she was now going to give to 6 people who would carry it wherever they flew. It was not the outcome she had expected when she sat down on that bench 14 months ago. It was, she thought, a considerably better one. The eastern horizon went from less dark to something that could reasonably be called grey, and then, in the way of things that had been accumulating toward a conclusion, the grey began incrementally to go gold dawn, without asking permission. Without waiting for anyone to decide they were ready, she watched it come. And when it reached the hangar, when the first direct light of the morning came through the opening, where she was standing, and moved across the concrete floor, and caught the name on the aircraft beneath the cockpit, and made it briefly very bright, she turned, walked back to the bench, picked up her flight bag, and went to begin what came next.